Well, folks, I covered the news today, I covered Death Knights today, and now it's time for our first card review for the March of the Lich King expansion. Because, of course, we've got Death Knight, and that's exciting, but lots of other fun new cards as well revealed for the new expansion, like Lorthamar here, a new neutral legendary minion. He's a 7-mana 7/7, and Battlecry, double the stats of all minions in your deck. So some potentially really big stat scaling there. This is reminiscent of a card like Imris we had way back in the day that would double cards in your hand, which could be a little bit more immediate perhaps than Lorthamar in regards to having those resources on hand already, but limited. You know, cards in deck can be a lot more cards and can hit things more consistently as well, because you may not always have the things that you want in your hand. So for instance, if you have big charge minions, Lorthamar can double up those charge minions. Your Mr. Smite is suddenly a 12 damage burst card instead of just 6. Or if you have a deck that's just looking for stuff like hand buffs or scales really well off stats thanks to like Lifesteal or Divine Shield or Rush, then Lorthamar can be a great way to power up all of those cards. Now, notably, this is not going to be for every deck, obviously, because you've got a pretty high price to pay here at 7 mana. You're not doing anything really on the turn you're playing Lorthamar, just dropping some base stats here. So you're expecting a long-term game plan where you're going to have enough time to draw into all of those cards, because you do have to get them to be able to play them. So you're going to need some turns to find all that stuff or specific ways to tutor things out to really make Lorthamar feel worth it. So you're going to need decks that can go higher into mana costs and still survive, and you're going to need decks that are running a lot of minions, and you're going to need decks that have a lot of survivability as well. So there are definitely a few boxes you have to check for Lorthamar to be a good fit in your deck. And even then, still a pretty slow and delayed upside. Like, it's going to take multiple turns to really realize the benefit of this one in most cases. So I think this will be one of those cards that's a really niche specific sort of use case. Maybe like one deck per expansion cycle is able to use Lorthamar in a compelling way. Classes like Druid and Paladin come to mind most readily for me. Seems to fit them the best as we currently envision them. So, you know, fine card, really high payoff on a long enough time scale, just a really specific use case. Moving on here to Invincible. I thought for sure this would be a Death Knight card, but Invincible, even though he is the Lich King's steed, is a neutral card. He's an 8-mana 5/5. He's using the new dual types. He's both undead and beast. We're going to see that pop up a few times, it seems, and retroactively applied to other cards as well. He's got Reborn, return of a keyword there with Reborn. He's got Battle Cry and Death Rattle. So a lot going on with this one. Basically, take all the new stuff and put it into a card. And those Battle Cry Death Rattles are give a random friendly undead +5/+5 and taunt. So major Bone Mare vibes on this. And if you remember Bone Mare, that was an undead horse, but Invincible's like the super version of Bone Mare, because not only are you giving that +5/+5 on a Battle Cry, you're also doing it on a Death Rattle. And remember, the Reborn version's also going to have the Death Rattle. So basically there are 3 total +5/+5 buffs here bundled with Invincible. Now, do note that this only hits undead minions specifically, so you're already narrowing this card quite a bit. Not every deck's going to be able to run this. They have to have some sort of undead focus, and frankly, I'd say quite a bit of undead focus to make sure there's some reliability here to ensure that you have stuff you can actually connect these stats on. Also noteworthy, Invincible will not be hitting himself. It's already confirmed if you play this on an empty board, he does not target himself. It has to be something that's in play already. And also noteworthy is that Death Rattles go off before Reborn. So in this case, he will not buff his own Reborn version. The Death Rattle would whiff if he were the only minion left on board. So, I think it's going to be kind of tough sometimes to land the buffs here for Invincible. And when you do, getting an immediate 5/5 on board can be a great way to push some extra damage, take a great value trade. We saw that back in the day with Bone Mare, but frankly, I don't think that scales very well to modern Hearthstone for an 8-mana card. Even though this buff is really big and this is a big pile of stats, it feels like it's going to be kind of piecemeal. You're going to get one chunk of it now, and then you're kind of giving the opponent a little bit more control over it. If you had some way to instantly activate the Death Rattles here on Invincible and really start stacking all those stats immediately, I'd have a little bit more faith in that. So maybe some of the instant Death Rattle activations in Rogue could be a way to utilize this. But all in all, between the on-board awkwardness that I think this is going to create sometimes and the deck restriction that it has to be focused on undead, there's a few problems with this card. I often think it's just going to be a tempo focused payoff that is too late in the game at 8 mana. I think it's going to be awkward on board, and I think it's going to fit into so few decks that I suspect Invincible really won't see all that much play despite being a big old pile of stuff. So next up here we have the Sunwell. This card's already being played. I haven't had a chance to hop in yet because I've been working on so many videos today, but it's a new 9 mana neutral spell, our first collectible neutral spell in Hearthstone. It's a legendary. It's a holy spell, and it reads, fill your hand with random spells, costs 1 less for each other card in your hand. So this card is kind of counterbalancing itself. If you have an empty hand, it's really expensive to play, but you get a bunch of stuff. If you have a full hand, it gets cheaper to play, but you don't get much out of it in return because there's no space left to fill your hand. So there are probably some sweet spots somewhere there in the middle, say like a 4, 5, 6 mana version of this, where it's a great way to generate a bunch of resources, but doesn't cost too much. And of course, there are ways for classes to manipulate the cost in other ways, cheat this out in something like Rogue with big spell synergies, something like Mage. You could cheat this out or replay it with a Dawn Grasp, given that it's your only holy spell. Paladin has ways to utilize holy spells in extra ways. So a handful of different ways to either, gain some benefits by playing this or reduce it or cheat it out or copy it that might make it worth it for certain decks. Now, ultimately, you are still looking at a card that's filling your hand with just a bunch of random stuff. It's not going to be cost discounted. It's not going to be particularly synergistic. It's not going to be aligned along a particular game plan. You're not going to get all face damage or all value cards. You're going to get a big mix of everything. And on average, the quality is going to be fairly low, I think. You're going to get like a random Demon Hunter Relic card that's not scaling or doing anything exciting. You're going to get some secret that's not exciting for you or that you care about that doesn't have secret synergies to make it more powerful. So, there's just all these low rolls and whiffs, and like sometimes you'll get good stuff, but often it's just going to be a bunch of random nonsense that doesn't really advance any sort of game plan. And I don't know what decks are going to make room for this because of that. Maybe if it's completely free to cheat out, maybe if you've got Burgle stuff in Rogue where you just want to get spells from other classes, and this is a great way to do that if you're only spending 4 mana on it with your Naga cheating it out. Like, that's an angle for this one, but still it feels very niche to me, and I think most decks will not feel like they need this sort of card. Card draw is so prevalent in Hearthstone today, and game plans are so synergistic in Hearthstone today that I think most decks have plenty of resources and game plans they're trying to achieve, and this doesn't really help in either direction because you don't need these resources and it doesn't help your game plan. So ultimately, I think a really fun card, a great meme. I'm going to have a ton of fun playing with this one, particularly later tonight. But as far as competitive decks are concerned, top of the meta is concerned, I don't see this Sunwell making the cut. So with the neutral legendaries out of the way, I want to hop over to the class cards for March of the Lich King here, starting off with some warrior stuff. This is Silver Fury Stalwart, a 6 mana 4/8 with taunt and rush, and can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. So, this is a little defensive tool. You can play down the really nice stat line here, often take a value trade. That 8 health, you're going to have a pretty decently sized minion left behind, I think, in a lot of board states. And then might be awkward for the opponent to deal with since it can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. They may have to push through it with minions legitimately. So this could often like 2 or 3 for 1 in aggro deck, which, that's not terrible. There's still something about this card though that's like, it's a little too honest. It's one of those cards that it's got a few things going on, but it feels a little too straightforward for me. It doesn't feel like the sort of thing that really benefits a ton from any particular synergies or game plans. I mean, I guess there could be a can't be targeted kind of deck that comes together or something, but all in all, just a solid card. Looks like an arena card, something you're happy to get off a Discover effect, but I suspect this doesn't make the cut in altogether too many deck lists. Feels like it doesn't do anything specific enough. So next up here is Embers of Strength, a 2 mana warrior spell. It's a fire spell, which is fairly rare in warrior. We've seen a few of the like lava themed ones from Sunken City, but Embers of Strength will summon 2 1/2 guards with taunt, and Mana Thirst 6 will give them +1/+2. So quick recap on Mana Thirst. That means when you have 6 mana, this card will have that extra bonus. So it's kind of like the things that upgrade at 5 mana or Omega cards that would upgrade at 10, but the Mana Thirst number differs per card. In this specific instance, once you get to 6 mana, you get this bonus. It doesn't cost that mana or anything. That's just the threshold that you have to reach. So at a base level, you get 2 1/2 taunts. So that's a little bit like the turtles in Druid. And, you know, a little stopgap there. There's a little board blocker, maybe some taunt synergies. Maybe you play it in a big deck because you need some summons early without running minions. And then late in the game, they become more frustrating to deal with. They're suddenly 2/4s. That's a little more noteworthy, a little harder to push through in some instances. Although by the time you get to 6 mana, still probably not really that crazy or problematic to deal with. If the Mana Thirst was 4, I think I'd be a lot more excited about a card like this one. Might be too good, but that's where I think it would feel better. At that Mana Thirst 6, I still think this one's just okay. Nothing too crazy here. Now, that said, they did tease perhaps a fire-themed deck for Warrior. It's kind of a side note, a little aside comment in the reveal stream. So perhaps this could have some fire synergies that expand on this, like doubling it or something cool, who knows. But keep an eye out there, because the fire angle could be what makes this card from just okay to actually pretty nifty. So next up, we have Shaman with Unliving Champion, 3 mana, 3/2 undead. Battlecry: if a friendly undead died after your last turn, summon 2 3/2 zombies. So the payoff here is enormous when this works. 3 3/2 minions for 3 mana. That feels like a great swarm, a ton of pressure, 9 damage develops on turn 3. If the opponent doesn't deal with that, you're just going to be chunking them for some big ol' hits. And Shaman, of course, can also leverage wide boards sometimes if a bunch of zombies get stuck around and there's going to be more zombie cards. It looks like something into a bloodlust type effect. Man, that's going to be absolutely overwhelming for people to deal with all of these different minions. But of course, we do have this condition to talk about, and this condition seems to be what all the like undead synergy units are going to be using, kind of like for elementals. It was played last turn. In this case, if a friendly undead died after your last turn, summon 2 3/2 zombies. So the idea here is you play an undead on turn 2, right? And if that was like a rush minion and you traded it in, it wouldn't count here because that did not die after your last turn. It died during your last turn. But if you leave it there and your opponent kills it for you, that's going to activate Unliving Champion. That means it will have died during your opponent's turn, which is after your last turn. Also, if it sticks behind and they don't kill it and you can trade it in on your current turn, the same turn you're going to play the Unliving Champion, if you trade it in now, then play the Unliving Champion, it's going to work because that was after your last turn. And initially, I thought maybe this had to be something where your opponent killed the minion, but I did check in with Blizzard, and sounds like you can trade it in on your current turn, and everything works out just fine. Now, that said, of course, if your opponent doesn't play something where you can trade it in, there are still some fail states. If you left the 2/2 behind on turn 2 and they don't play a minion, you may not have a way to kill it off. It may still be alive, and your Unliving Champion will whiff. So your opponent could actually make some pretty interesting decisions where they don't enable you some way to kill off your 2-drop to deny you your Unliving Champion. So I don't know how often that's going to happen. You know, in a minion-based battle in particular, your opponent's probably very often to play stuff. They're not going to want to skip their turn 2. If they did skip their turn 2, then, you know, maybe you still netted some benefit by having the Unliving Champion exist. You don't necessarily have to get a huge payoff of it if you're gaining some tempo advantages just with the threat of the Unliving Champion. So all in all, I think it's an effect that will work very often. You're going to have a lot of undead kind of sticking around, being able to trade in. Might even have effects that sacrifice them yourself. And then when it does work, I think this payoff is huge for 3 mana. This looks like a high power output card for sure. We've also got here the Death Weaver Aura for Shaman, a 2 mana spell. It reads, give a minion Death Rattle, summon 2 3/2 zombies, and overload 1. So nice little early game way to shore up a board state and make sure you've got some early minions to build off of. I don't know if there's going to be other ways to leverage all of these different zombies, some kind of follow-up card that cares a lot about having a wide board. I mean, Bloodlust, of course, the staple of old from benefiting from a wide swarmy board early, but we might see other things. There's obviously evolve effects as well, but this and evolve don't really go together too well because if this particular minion didn't die, you wouldn't really want to evolve this enchantment off, so that may not be the answer, but nonetheless, Shaman historically has done well with wide boards, and I like this idea here of having the opportunity to protect your board, make sure you've got that backup plan. It's a Soul of the Forest light for 2 mana, but honestly pumps out a lot of damage for only 2 mana, and you only need 1 minion to make it good. There is a question, you know, if you're looking for a tempo play, sometimes it's better to just play the minion outright, because if this doesn't die, if the opponent doesn't kill it, if you don't have a great trade for it, you've spent your 2 mana to do nothing for a while. It's just sitting there waiting to activate, and you could have spent that mana on something that is more immediately high pressure. So there is that question, but I think ultimately, again, it's about friction. If you build a threatening enough board or your opponent has to clear it, having this as that reassurance that something's going to stick on board is often worth it, much like we've seen in Token Druid doing this in the past. So I think this card has, again, enough output to make it worth it. So next up here, we've got the Blood Matriarch Liadrin. This is really cool. 2 mana, 3/2. After you summon a minion with less attack than this, give it Divine Shield and Rush. So, you know, your Silverhand recruits right off the bat all have Divine Shield and Rush if Blood Matriarch Liadrin is on board, which that's not too bad. You know, there's some solid like 4 mana summon a bunch of dudes and giving them all Divine Shield right off the bat. That could work for the Matriarch here. You may not need much more than that, but I think there's another angle here for Matriarch as well, which is hand buffs. If you're able to buff this card up, or even just buff it on board as well, it doesn't have to be a hand buff. In either case, when you expand her attack value, then suddenly any additional minion summoned, a lot of stuff fits in under her attack and gets Divine Shield and Rush. You know, you give this 5 attack, you got a bunch of 4 attack stuff with Divine Shield and Rush, which is awesome. And a weakness for a lot of cards like this in the past has been that sometimes they'll lack any sort of reactivity. These kind of like setup cards or things that buff other minions can just kind of feel flat on board, but the fact that they're getting Rush and Divine Shield means this becomes a really powerful board clear tool. You can play this with some stuff, clear your opponent's board, and be left with a really threatening minion behind with the Matriarch. They're going to want to deal with this because it sets up another great board clear in the future, but also a bunch of other things that take great value trades thanks to the Divine Shields. So all in all, this feels like a really powerful swing potential card with only a little bit of support to make it amazing across a variety of minion types, but also in a dude deck, it might not need too much support to feel good. Or, you know, 2 attacks also a sweet spot as well. So if you got a bunch of 2 attack things, the Matriarch here might work also very nicely. All in all, seems like it does a lot for a very low mana cost, and I like that. And speaking of buffs for minions, we've got 4 Quel'Thalas, a new 2 mana holy spell for Paladin, gives a friendly minion +3 attack, great for your Liadrin, and it gives your hero +2 attack this turn. So all in all, that's 5 damage for 2 mana, and I like the way that it's staggered a little bit too. Sometimes that can really help getting clean math if you need to push through a taunt or something, but sometimes just hitting face for 5 is gonna feel really nice as well. So whether you're using it for that Liadrin setup, whether you're just buffing a nice Divine Shield minion, getting a little extra life steal off of a life steal minion, whatever it is, I could see Quel'Thalas actually being a really efficient output card. And I think we might just see aggro decks running this for 2 mana deal 5. That's a lot of damage. So all in all, looks pretty good. So next up, moving over to Mage, we have Arcane Defenders finally filling that 8 mana Mage slot we've been looking for. It's an arcane spell that summons 2 5/6 golems with taunt and can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. So just this little frustrating board summoning here. Might be hard for some decks to push through these effectively, whether they're relying on single target removal or just have to work through these with minions. It is just 12 health and taunts. Nice little board stall. I don't think most mages are going to be super happy about spending 8 mana outright for a card like this. I think it's fairly disappointing straight up, but of course we've got big spell synergy stuff in Mage, which allows them to replay this really effectively. You cheat it out sooner with things like Belinda. In those instances, as soon as you start to take any mana off this, I think it looks a lot more interesting. If this is a 5/6 mana play, or of course cheated out of your deck or replayed for free with Dawn Grasp, that is suddenly a very exciting sort of spell. So you might be willing to take a few, you know, bad instances of playing this just in order to realize those really good instances of replaying it for free. All in all, that means this might be a high utility spell for some big spell mages. I could see this slotting in rather nicely to decks that are already working fairly well. We've also got the Arcane Bolt for Mage, new arcane spell, 1 mana this time, deals 2 damage, so 1 mana deal 2, can go face or hit minions, and Mana Thirst 8, deal 3 damage instead. So that is a really high Mana Thirst threshold, I feel like, for a 1 mana spell. You know, it takes forever to get that 1 extra damage, which doesn't seem insane to me. Like, yeah, 1 mana deal 3 is very efficient, but it's not like crazy, you know. It's a lot of time waited just to get a tiny upside there. So here's the deal, right? At a base level, we've seen some 1 mana deal 2 stuff make sense. The arcane shots of the world for decks that are looking for either like spell synergies, spamming out spells, or just really need some damage output. That's fine. I don't know that Mage needs this as much. I feel like this is one of those cards that only very specific decks are going to be able to run if they care about cheap spells, cycling, things like we've seen with Naga mages wanting a bunch of cheap spells. I mean, maybe something like Arcane Bolt makes sense. Maybe if you just need critical mass of arcane spells for an arcane synergy deck, those are the things that make this stand out to me. As it stands on its own rights, outside of those really specific synergies, I don't know that 1 mana deal 2 really makes the cut, and I don't think the Mana Thirst 8 here makes this any more compelling. Speaking of arcane spells, we have the Arcane Quiver for Hunter here, 2 mana spell. Discover a spell from your deck. If it's arcane, give it spell damage +1. So the trappings here of a trappings for Hunter, the trappings for an arcane synergy deck in Hunter, and this is kind of like a tracking, allowing you to find a specific thing and then buff that specific thing, which for 2 mana, you know what, I don't think that's crazy. We've seen a few of these work in classes like Priest. We got tracking itself in Hunter, where discovering a spell can be really good to help you find the right sorts of things at the right times, and then the spell damage bonus can be nice too. I don't know how exactly that's going to scale across arcane spells in Hunter moving forward, but we have had things in the past where that's nice, where, you know, that spell damage is basically doubling up. We've got things like Moonbeam and Druid where spell damage scales really nicely on it. So there may be spells built specifically here for the Arcane Quiver to really take advantage of that spell damage, where it, you know, duplicates in some way or another, or gets bigger than just that spell damage +1. But ultimately, really specific tutors are good and upsides are bonus. So moving on here to the Nerubian Flyer for Druid, a 2 mana 2/3 undead. Battle cry of a friendly undead died after your last turn. Summon a 2/2 Nerubian. So this is basically exactly like that Shaman card we talked about earlier, but just a 2-drop that summons a 2/2. But again, great way to potentially get, you know, nice early start on the board in a class in Druid that loves going wide, loves playing for tokens like this. So you could see an undead swarm deck in Druid coming together rather nicely with a card like this, helping to enable that. I will say on turn 2, if you were playing this on curve, does feel like it might be a little bit harder to consistently hit this check. It may be harder to kill off, say, a 1-drop undead specifically. You're not having a lot of time to find something to play and find a way to trade it in. So this might be something that's better off in the mid game, and then maybe it doesn't pack quite as much punch in the mid game as something like that Shaman card. So perhaps a tad more awkward feeling for me just because of the way it slots into mana. I don't know if you're excited to play this on turn 5 as much, and I don't know if it's going to work as well on turn 2. So does it fall in the gaps there a little bit where it feels like it just doesn't really line up well enough? Maybe. For Demon Hunter here, we have Deal with a Devil, a 5 mana Fel spell. Summon 2 3/3 Fel Fiends with Lifesteal. So not the most exciting play for 5 mana, just getting a couple 3/3s passively with Lifesteal. And then if your deck has no minions, summon another. So 3 3/3s with Lifesteal. And you have a no minion condition here for Demon Hunter. So we're going to get a no minion Demon Hunter deck, a spell Demon Hunter deck. That's kind of crazy. Sadly, though, I don't actually think 3 3/3s with Lifesteal is very exciting either. It's just so passive. Demon Hunter already has a way to summon like 2 2/2s with Lifesteal very affordably. That's not exciting or good. I don't think these are big enough or meaningful enough to make any sense. I guess if the spell deck is good enough and you just need a way to get any minions, or you have some way to really discount this, you know, if this costs 3 mana or 4 mana, maybe we're talking. At 5 mana, not as exciting to me. So I think this one is going to be very dependent on synergies for it to make sense. As it stands in a vacuum right now, this looks way too passive and very hard to activate. So I guess keep an eye out. I honestly am having trouble envisioning how strong the synergies would have to be to make this feel really good, or how well the deck would have to come together for this to feel good, because just doesn't really feel like the card is doing all that much. But, you know, if you give this to 2 mana for me, 3 mana, we're talking. Like, that's suddenly a very good card. So potential is there, but very, very latent and perhaps very hard to find. So our final cards here are the Death Knight cards. Do notice these are part of the March of the Lich King expansion. We do have additional Death Knight cards, which are part of the core set or the Path of Arthas set. I'm covering those in a separate video. This is for the expansion, but we do have 3 Death Knight cards, starting off with Acolyte of Death, a 3-mana 3/4 that reads, after a friendly undead dies, draw a card. So this is a Cult Master sort of effect specifically for Death Knights, and obviously they're going to have a lot of tokens floating around, whether from their hero power or just undeads otherwise. And I think there will be a lot of scenarios where a couple things are still hanging around. By turn 3, you trade them in, and the Acolyte of Death draws you a couple cards while depositing a 3/4. Maybe she only gets you 1, but hangs around for a future hero power or rush minion and gets a couple more cards. So on average, I think getting 2+ cards out of this is rather feasible based on what we've seen so far for Death Knight. And that makes this really effective. Great stat line for something that's drawing you 2 cards, right? And sometimes maybe even more, with some crazy leftover boards and stuff. So this is a rune card, which means you're not going to be able to play this in a fully unholy deck, which might be the best for summoning lots of minions, but I could easily see this flexing into a deck that's otherwise running unholy rune cards that are going to give you all of those bodies you're looking for to make this one really nice. So I think important that this is only a single frost rune so that it's not too restricted into the decks that it can fit into. So next up, we have Vampiric Blood. This is a 3 blood rune card. So this is only, again, going to be able to be played in decks that are fully committed to blood runes. You can't run your Acolyte of Death in a deck running Vampiric Blood. So very specific. And this one's going to give your hero +5 health. And if you spend 3 of your corpses, you're going to gain 5 more and draw a card. So this is probably not something you're playing on turn 2 with 3 corpses. You're probably going to wait a little bit more till the mid game to accrue some of those corpses, and then I think a really nice payoff. It's just cycling into a new card while potentially giving you 10 health, and that's giving you 10 health. It's not restoring it. So that can go above your max, which means by the time you play 2 of these, any kind of spell repeating effects, you can start to stack up a lot of health, which in a deck that's using blood rune cards, you're probably going to be using that health as a resource to remove things. You're going to be healing it up. So nice to have a high health total to work with. And I think this is ultimately a really efficient card with, not a lot of tax to play because it's cycling into something new, but a huge upside on this health, which could be really important to work with. And I think the corpse tax here too is pretty low at 3. That might be more in a blood deck. It sounds like they're not going to have as many ways to make tokens, but there's at least always the hero power for Death Knight, and I'm sure you'll find other ways to run small stuff to enable here the Vampiric Blood. And then finally we have Corpse Explosion, a 2 blood rune card. So you would have a little bit of flexibility here to add in that other rune. It's a 5-mana shadow spell. Detonate a corpse to deal 1 damage to all minions, and if any are still alive, repeat this. So each repeat will also demand a corpse in order to activate. That's a part of the text there. So if your opponent has a board full of 5/5s, you'll need 5 corpses, and then you can deal 5 damage to clear that board of 5/5s. And if you have enough corpses, this could theoretically clear any board, I guess. I don't know if it has a limit on it. It may only go up to certain number totals like some cards do, but theoretically can clear any board here with the Corpse Explosion as long as you have enough corpses. I personally think, I don't know how many corpses you're going to have in Death Knight, but I could see some scenarios where there's like an 8/8 on board along with other stuff or whatever, and you need to clear it and you don't have the corpses necessary to do it for Corpse Explosion. And this card feels a little bit stuck or kind of clunky in hand. I'm envisioning scenarios where this does not feel like that reliable of a board clear. Sometimes you need these board clears to just work, and I worry this one won't. And we have so many other examples of 5-mana wide board clears that are good in Hearthstone that don't demand quite as much resources, or checks on them in order to work. So I do worry about the downsides of this one. Yes, when things are flowing nicely, it's going to be a very efficient, guaranteed board clear. Yes, you can kill off your own minions, perhaps mid-cycle, and get additional corpses to help, but still that demands you have minions on board for that. So I don't know. I just see this one being awkward in my mind. It's one of those, of course, you need some experience in playing it, but don't be surprised if there's moments where you can't play Corpse Explosion and you're really frustrated. So we've got a few other neutral minions I wanted to circle back to. The Sun Fury Clergy, a 3-mana 2/4. Battlecry, restore 3 health to all friendly characters. A little bit of heal there. And Mana Thirst 6, restore 6 health instead. So, you know, we've got an Earthen Farseer type minion, but can buff or heal your entire board and can get a big heal if played late in the game. And 3 for 6 is a pretty nice heal. We've seen a few of these healing cards pop up. We've got the Spiced Bread Baker shows up in like Warlock sometimes. It's a big heal for hand buff decks. This doesn't feel like it's going to be quite as reliable, quite as early as a card like that. But I mean, this has some maybe fringe potential in a deck like Death Knight that cares about healing or has high health totals. Maybe you just need more total healing and the Clergy makes sense. Priest might have ways to utilize this healing. So it does do a lot, frankly, for 3 mana. There's actually a lot happening in this card for only 3 mana. It scales well in the late game. So I would normally write this off, but that Mana Thirst really does help make this a more significant heal. And just being able to heal everything too is a big effect for 3 mana. So I'm going to give the Sun Fury Clergy a little bit of a shot. Next up is the Infected Peasant, a 2-mana 2/1 with Death Rattle. Summon a 2/2 Undead Peasant. And you know what? I think this is actually quite a bit of stuff stapled into this card here. You've got Undead synergies on the Undead Peasant if you need an Undead laying around. You've got Death Rattle synergies, which, you know, if you have an aggressive Death Rattle deck or one that just needs a lot of tokens on board and sticky bodies and corpses for Death Knight, all of that seems to play rather nicely here into the Infected Peasant. And ultimately, just having those minions stick around can be good for decks that are trying to utilize buffs or follow-up cards. So sure enough, I don't think I hate the Infected Peasant here. This card might actually make its way into a deck here and there. The Silver Moon Sentinel here is a 3-mana 2/5 taunt with Mana Thirst 8, gain +2/+2, and Divine Shield. So played early in the game, 2/5 taunt, played late in the game after 8 mana, and suddenly you've got a 4/7 taunt with Divine Shield for 3 mana. And obviously that 8 mana version that's spicy, right? That's a very efficient play for 3 mana and could really come down late and be a big sort of swing, you know, big stabilizer late in the game. Play a couple of these on turn 8 and shut down an aggro deck sort of thing on board. You could see that happening. Are you willing to run this card though for that payoff, or do you need cards like this one to be good enough early? And is it good enough at 3 mana? I don't think so. When I compare this to stuff like the Heal Quillbore, that's a 3-mana 2/4 that restores life when it dies. I think that's so much better at 3 mana. And frankly, you know, still pretty good late in the game too, because that healing can really matter late in the game. Although this card scales so much, I think the scaling happens just a little too late and the baseline's just not quite good enough. So if you kind of pulled the ends of this together and you made it like a 3/5, of course, be like, oh yeah, spicy. Or maybe you made it Mana Thirst 5, gain 1/1 in Divine Shield. I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes a little bit more sense to me. But I think it's stretched out just a little bit too much on each end to actually feel good in either spot. Moving on to the Bone Flinger, another undead synergy card here. 2-mana 2/3 battle cry. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, deal 2 damage. So a little bit of a, you know, SI7 agent here for undeads. I guess he's throwing his arm at people. That's amusing. For me, I don't love this one as much, honestly. Like, you know, sometimes these little swingy cards have been good. There's like the Pirate, the SI7 agent. But ultimately, for undead decks, I think you're going to want more bodies on average. So things that are summoning more minions, have those death rattle effects. All of that plays a little more nicely into the undead chains and the synergies I expect you're going to want to utilize for undead. Whereas this doesn't really pay into that as much. It's just that single minion doesn't feel like it's really fueling things quite as nicely as those other decks or cards that are going wider or death rattly. So I don't know, it's fine, but it's just one of those cards I suspect most decks I'm like, yeah, I don't really need it. Perhaps there's just not enough undead and you have to run every undead in a deck. So the Bone Flinger makes the cut, but I think it would be very near the bottom of the deck list, or one of the cards you're probably less excited to see or really play with in most undead lists. So next up here is the Street Sweeper, a 4-mana 2/2 battlecry, deal 2 damage to all other minions. And you know what? I think this guy might see some play. There's a lot of decks that lack good mid-game AoE. I don't think this is the strongest mid-game AoE, but it's fine. It might serve a niche for decks that do need this. And since it's a neutral card, they can pop it in and work with the Street Sweeper. Will every class have a card that's better at doing the same thing? I don't think so. I think there will be a class here and there that might need the Street Sweeper to just fill that need, or other classes that do have good AoEs might just need enough to get their deck into a good spot, and the Street Sweeper is just a good fit. And with all the undead and reborn stuff floating around, I think there will be a lot of scenarios where this is actually a relevant sort of board clear. Rancor has worked really well in Warrior. This is a Rancor on a stick. Yeah, you don't gain the armor, but some decks will just need that Rancor clear in the first place. The Consecration, the whatever example, Holy Nova you're looking for, Street Sweeper is a neutral example of those, and historically those have worked fairly well. And then finally we have the Scourge Rager. He's only got one leg, this poor guy. I like to imagine he's on an ice skate down there, though we can't see it. He's a 3-mana 5/4 undead reborn, Battlecry, die. So he plays, he immediately dies. And then of course when he's reborn, he's a 5/1, the Rager stat line, which is pretty cool to get a Rager. Fun way to get a little Rager here. And the dying, of course, can help in certain scenarios. If you're playing infused cards, you know, you got Death Knight, corpses, all that stuff does matter. Remember that the undead dying here will not work for your undead synergy cards, because that will be during your turn, not after your last turn. So not actually a great undead enabler necessarily off that battle cry, but still some fun shenanigans. Now, do I think this card's going to be good? No. I really don't. As much as I wish a Rager could be good, ultimately still that 5/1 stat line is just too susceptible. I don't think it's going to set up too nicely for other undead synergy payoffs. I'm sad to say the Scourge Rager, despite being really clever and fun and awesome and great flavor, I don't think this card will get played much. Lorthamar is a 3-star card. Invincible is a 2-star card. The Sunwell is a 2-star card. Sun Fury Clergy is a 3-star card. Infected Peasant is a 4-star card. Street Sweeper is a 4-star card. Silvermoon Sentinel is a 2-star card. Bone Flinger is a 2-star card. Scourge Rager is a 2-star card. Silver Fury Stalwart is a 2-star card. Embers of Strength is a 3-star card. Unliving Champion is a 4-star card. Death Weaver Aura is a 3-star card. Blood Matriarch Liadrin is a 4-star card. For Quel'Thalas is a 4-star card. Arcane Defenders is a 3-star card. Arcane Bolt is a 3-star card. Arcane Quiver is a 4-star card. Nerubian Flyer is a 3-star card. Deal with a Devil is a 2-star card. Acolyte of Death is a 4-star card. Vampiric Blood is a 4-star card. Corpse Explosion is a 3-star card. So there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. This was a long one because we got a ton of cards. I got more coming tomorrow for more Death Knight cards. It sounds like reveals are going to be starting within like the next week or so for additional card reveals. So lots of card reviews all month long. So much stuff to talk about. Share your thoughts on these cards and more down in the comments below. Thanks so much as always for watching. And until next time, game on.